All right, Christian from MacDon here today. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about your auger and some of the adjustments that you can make. Do you want to run your auger in the floating position, or do you want to run it in the locked rigid position? Or do we want to adjust how much tension it takes for this auger to float up and down? So we're going to address some of those conditions in today's series of videos. Okay, so first thing we're going to talk about is the floating versus the rigid mode. When you receive your header, it should be in the floating position. So your auger is designed to basically take your crop from your side drapers and feed drapers and then get it into the feeder house of the combine. The auger has the ability to float up and down as crop enters it. So if you get a large clump of crop, it doesn't get stuck underneath the auger. The auger can actually float up so the crop can get underneath. Once again, as we're harvesting, if a big clump of crop comes in there, then the auger can float up and down, just to manage the crop as it enters the feeder house. The floating mode is good for the majority of the crops that we'll harvest. Depending on what crops you're harvesting, especially large, fluffy, high volume crops, things like canola, oilseed rape, or maybe peas, you may want to lock the auger in the rigid mode, which increases the clearance between the feed pan and the auger. Make sure to drop the feeder house stop on your feeder house lock, whatever. So this is what we're adjusting here. So we're underneath the combine now, and what we're going to do is we're going to adjust these levers over here. And this is how we adjust from floating to rigid position. If you were so inclined, inside your operator's manual, there are instructions on how to do this. But why would you want to read the operator's manual when Chris will make a video? There is a little indicator there, sort of a squiggly line. That indicates that we are currently in the floating position. So to do this, we're going to need some tools, nothing fancy. So we got a 21 mil wrench. Yes, it's metric. I'm sorry. Undo this a couple turns, and then we're going to move this lever over into the fixed position. So to rotate the cam, because it does require a little bit of force, I'm going to put, I think you just knocked out the mic. I think I just lost my mic. Now to do that, it does take a fair bit of force, so I'm going to just put another 21 mil socket on this bar. So you'll feel it kind of go clunk, clunk, and now it is in the rigid position. So now we'll tighten up that bolt with our 21 mil. All right, now that we've tightened the bolt, we need to torque it. The torque spec on this is 122 Newton meters or 90 foot-pounds. So to get in here, what I'm gonna do is, this is the latch for the poly door. I'm just gonna move that slightly out of the way. Get in here and torque it. Put the poly door latch back in position. So now we need to repeat this procedure on the other side of the auger. So now, if I go back in like I did before with my bar, there's basically little to no movement because it's already at its highest position. So now there's a lot more room here, now that we've raised it up and locked it in position, that a lot more crop can be fed underneath the auger because there's physically more distance between the auger shell and the feed pan. So now that the auger is in its fixed position, there's a lot more room underneath the auger for crop to feed. So if you're having issues with slug feeding, or you're hearing a lot of banging from your auger because it's not a nice smooth flow of crop, because of course sometimes we don't always have ideal conditions, this is something you can try. It takes you basically about 10 minutes to do it. If it improves your feeding conditions, great. Leave it that way. Now, I probably wouldn't leave it like this the entire season, because again, if you get into some thin light crop, the distance between the flighting and the auger has changed significantly. We've increased that. It may not convey like you want. So again, depending on your conditions, run it in the floating position for most conditions. Depending on your crop, depending on your conditions, you'll want to run it in the floating position most of the time, but for some of that real high volume crop, you may want to switch it to the fixed rigid position. So now if we want to undo this condition, we'll go back underneath the header and we'll put it back into the floating mode. This is tough to see. You won't be able to see it at all, but, but I can point like a point. Two-handed point from way back. This is something you might want to do again when you're harvesting those high volume crops. In your operator's manual, there is a section called canola optimization, and this is mentioned in that. So if you want to adjust the auger hold down tension, this bolt right here is where you want to make your adjustment. So on the other side of this bolt is a pretty heavy duty spring that's keeping the auger in the downward position. So if we back off this nut here, what we'll do is we'll release some of the tension and we can make the auger easier to float up and down. So with a 16 mil socket, sorry again, what we're gonna do is we're gonna just undo this nut. And as I undo it, you're gonna see that the stem of this bolt is gonna get shorter and shorter. So I'm gonna back off the tension. And again, this is something you can experiment with how much if you wanna back it way off. We still got a fair amount there. So we wanna make sure that we don't take it too far off. All right, here we're at the point where it's just snug. So I'm gonna leave it right there. Now on the top side is a jam nut, which is not the easiest thing to access. So you wanna make sure that you tighten up that jam nut as well. So again, this nut doesn't fall off. Be sure to do this on both sides, and you'll wanna make both sides even. So measure how much of the bolt is extending past the nut and just make both sides match. So here we can see, here's the spring that we were adjusting. So it's attached to the auger hold down. So as we extend or retract that bolt, we're going to increase or decrease the tension on this, which will make the auger float up easier or heavier depending on what we want. So the jam nut, after you make your adjustment, is right on the top of that plate. You can access it from underneath, but it's not the easiest thing to get at. So now that you've backed off your tension, on the top side here is your jam nut, so you can run that down with your finger and then snug it up from the bottom. So now the pressure that it takes for this auger to float up and down is much less than it was before. So again, if you've got high volume crops, or maybe you've just got stuff that's lodged and it's coming in really lumpy, you can back off the tension. And if that helps with your harvesting performance, then go right ahead. So you can see that we are a little bit shallow here. So if we want to put this back to where it was originally, we want to measure from the nut, see how much of the thread is exposed, and we want that to be between 7/8 and 1 inch to restore this back to where it was from factory. The guy who needs new glasses. So I got the jam nut with my finger. Lock it down. Repeat this on the other side and you're done. It's nice to work on brand new machinery. Sorry if yours is not brand new. It's something that's relatively easy to do. A little bit of time, no special tools required, and it's an easy adjustment.